Hi, everybody. It's great to see you again. I am Martha Seelman. I am the Executive Director of Studio Art Quilt Associates, SAQA, or SAQA, as we like to call it. SAQA, along with the Surface Design Association, the Quilt Alliance, and the International Quilt Museum, put together this series of presentations every Wednesday, and we're delighted to see you here today. Before we get started with today's really exciting presentation, I want to tell you that SAQA is going to be holding a wonderful mini conference that is also going to be virtual in the middle of July. It's called Art in Place, and it's going to be celebrating how where you live affects the art you make. So our keynote speaker is going to be Carolyn Crump, talking about her work and how her life in Texas affects what she makes. Yoko Sakita is going to be talking about her life in Japan and how that affects her work. We're going to hear from 3 of the bird artists who are featured in my forthcoming book on birds in fiber art. So we're going to hear about Australia and South Africa and England, and how each of those locations affects the art that those artists make. Plus, lots more wonderful presentations. Attending Art in Place is easy. Just go to SAQA.com, click on events, and look for Art in Place. Anybody can attend. It's $100 for non-members, $70 for members. And if you would like to become a member of SAQA, please use the discount code TALKS, TALKS, and we would love to have you join our community. So today's presenter is Diana Baumbach, and I am really excited to see her presentation and to see your reaction to her presentation. When she sent in an application to be one of our Textile Talk presenters, I was very excited by her work because it combines 2 components which I always love. She works a lot with circular forms and with repetition of forms. And both of those just sort of speak to my soul. So I'm always drawn to work that uses those forms. And Diana is going to be talking to you about her inspiration, her techniques, and how her work has evolved over time. So sit back, enjoy, and Diana, over to you.
Thanks, Martha. So before we get started, I just wanted to say how excited I am to be here today. I'm really sort of shocked by the reach of this. I'm seeing people from all over the world, as well as some really familiar names. And it's just such a joy to be able to connect with you on a beautiful day like today. So thanks for taking the time to be here. Also, I'm excited because this is an audience that is maybe a little bit different than I typically talk to. So I'm really curious to hear your feedback and questions that come up. I think that this is an opportunity for me to learn just as much from you all as hopefully you'll gain from what I have to share. One last thing I just wanted to mention before we get started is there will be a short film as part of my presentation. And I just wanted to make note that it's not a completed piece. It's sort of a preview of it. It's a work in progress. So just to make note of that. But I think it's still worth sharing and hopefully you'll enjoy it. So I think that's all I have for now.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Hi, and thanks for joining me. And thank you to the Studio Art Quilt Associates for the opportunity to share my work today. My name is Diana Baumbach, and I'll use this opportunity to talk about how my creative practice has given voice to my personal narrative. I've used craft to communicate things that I've struggled to put into words. Bear with me for just one moment while I start sharing my screen. So before I begin, I'd like to let you know that this talk will mention medical trauma, family conflict, and mental health challenges. In the interest of being considerate of the privacy of others, I'll speak in generalities and will not go into detail about my personal life. Please take care of yourself if these topics are challenging for you. I also wanted to acknowledge that much of my work is made of cotton paper, which will require you to think more broadly about the notion of fiber art. The title of my talk is Speaking Through My Hands. I'll begin with some background. I grew up just outside of Chicago in Oak Park, Illinois. The village is best known for being the location of Frank Lloyd Wright's home and studio, which you can see on the left. On the right is the home that I grew up in, designed by Jerome Cerny. Frank Lloyd Wright lived and worked in his home. It was a dual-purpose space. In addition to designing structures, he designed functional objects for the home, such as stained glass, textiles, and furniture. I grew up with a mother who was an artist and also had a studio in our home. Because of this, I've always seen a close connection between daily life and creative work. Here are some of the textiles and stained glass pieces that Frank Lloyd Wright designed in his home studio to be used in the homes that he designed. My early work focused on the idea of craft, art, and lived experience. I painstakingly made recreations of disposable textiles, thinking broadly, such as paper towels, toilet paper, and napkins. I was interested in putting labor and care into my own disposable goods. This gave these objects new meaning and value. Here you can see pieces that were made by very slowly and repetitively piercing paper using a needle to approximate the surfaces of these familiar disposable goods. The more pokes I did, the more the paper took on new forms and started to curl under itself. These patterns were hand-drawn and painted and printed based on patterns that I found on paper towels. You can see the influence of Frank Lloyd Wright in how I explored the designed objects around me. And this piece was made from thousands of paper circles, which I wove into a quasi-textile. I wanted it to reference a functional object in the home, like wallpaper or fabric. I made this piece in small segments of roughly 1 foot by 1 foot while I was relaxing each night on my couch at home. The segments were then assembled into a 12 foot by 6 foot fabric in the gallery, and this piece is tied to my daily experience of making the work, but in a way that shared very little of the specifics of my own story. Instead, I focused on, at this point in my career, on referencing objects that we can all relate to. My approach to making art changed significantly with the birth of my first son. I suffered from preeclampsia, which progressed into severe HELLP syndrome. I had to be medically transported across state lines for life-saving treatment and was unable to see my son after his birth because of my unstable state. Becoming a mother was a sort of cognitive knot. Carolyn Edwards, a Reggio Emilia educator, describes cognitive knots. Just as a whirl in wood grain, a knot or a whirl in wood grain impedes a saw cutting through it, and just as a knot or a tangle in thread stops the action of a sewing needle, any problem that stops the children and stops their action is a kind of cognitive knot. Such knots should be thought of as more than negative moments of confusion and frustration, however. Rather, they are moments of cognitive disequilibrium, containing positive possibilities for regrouping, hypothesis testing, and intellectual comparison of ideas. They can produce interactions that are constructive not only for socializing, but also for constructing new knowledge. For the first 365 days following the birth of my first son, I made a 4-inch by 4-inch piece daily. I poked a hole in the approximated center, tied a French knot, and made perforated circles if time allowed, which, as you can see here, often it didn't. This process allowed me to measure time, balance art making and motherhood, and recognize the ebb and flow of my creative practice while acknowledging the value of time spent away from the studio. It also supported me in slowly healing from the medical trauma of my pregnancy and birth. Although these are made of paper, the perforations create fabric-like qualities, and the accumulated squares are reminiscent of a quilt. As Lucy Lepard states, what is popularly seen as repetitive, obsessive, and compulsive in women's art is in fact a necessity for those whose time comes in small squares. The accumulated pieces create a sort of calendar that are a record for his first year of life. It took me many months to recover from HELP syndrome. Most days I could manage little more than basic care and healing. This was compounded by challenges in my home life where I was the primary caretaker. In a way, this sort of marking time bears some similarities to coping strategies seen in prisons. This work was inspired by Ankoir's Today series, which consists of meticulously painted dates and accompanying newspapers from that day. It was also heavily influenced by the role of materiality and the minutiae of mothering in Mary Kelly's postpartum document. If you're not familiar with this work, Kelly integrates textiles, ephemera, and residue left over from the act of caring for a child. I sought out ways to center myself during the postpartum period. I began by cutting concentric circles where I approximated the center point and then recentered myself with each successive ring. The process was a literal and metaphoric recentering. When I experimented with layering the work, moire patterns emerged, creating visual confusion. I showed these in pairs and they began to take on new meaning. They were breast-like. They looked back at me. And they reflected my dazed state. In time, these confused circles grew into large installations which were human-scaled. This piece re-envisions my smaller work using layers of hand-cut Tyvek and vinyl. The shift between the small paperwork and these large installations has long been of interest to me. I like when something personal and small becomes a shared experience. And here they were built out of offset Duralar and vinyl. I was interested in how the process of cutting concentric circles calmed and confused me simultaneously, especially when they were overlaid. When the viewer stands in front of the work, they struggle to untangle the patterns. This reflected my own mental state at the time. The scale, materials, and content of this work is reminiscent of the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, which explores maternal mental health and treatment of women postpartum in relation to textiles in the home, specifically wallpaper. As my child grew, I continued to attempt to untangle the cognitive knots posed by a challenging home life and renegotiating my identity as a mother. I made these pieces where I recreated his early drawings by couching lines on muslin in an effort to communicate with my son and regulate my nervous system using fibers. They're reminiscent of knots or tangles, which is an apt metaphor for how I felt at the time. I used slow handwork to process trauma and tell my story through the act of making. The rhythmic movement of stitching and the tactile experience of working with fibers nurtured self-soothing, emotional regulation, and meditative states. Thus, fiber became a vehicle for embodied narrative. I was thinking about Incan quipu, which Dr. Kyle Quave describes this way. The Incan of the Andean region built impressive monuments and ruled diverse peoples, yet they did this without a way of writing. What the Inca did was use the quipu, a knotted string record-keeping device, leading some people to ask, what really is writing anyway? Inca quipus are bundles of woolen cords tied together with knots added to them to encode information. I also made work prior to the birth of my second son. Because of my history of serious health issues, I had to relocate to Denver for the month prior to his birth so that I would have easy access to the high-risk doctors. During that time, I was separated from my family and spent time waiting in anticipation. To keep my hands busy, I folded mulberry paper and came up with a system of lines and dots to mark time once again. Here are some of the details of that work where I explored layering, shadows, gaps, and patterns. These were all part of the visual language that I devised for myself. Once both of my children had grown beyond their baby years, I made work that explored the next phase in my role as a parent through materials, process, and form. This piece was made from my kids' used onesies, their baby clothing, which I cut into tiny pieces and beat to a pulp in a Hollander beater, then made into thick, handmade cotton paper. I was interested in the slippage from one form to the next, from clothing or fabric to paper, and the personal history of that material. It was laden with emotional connections. I sculpted the paper into dimensional concentric circles and tied them together with woolen protrusions. The form was meant to reference breasts, umbilical cords, flowing milk, tethers, pulleys, and rings on a tree. Shredding the children's clothing indicated the literal cutting of ties with childbearing and helped me to process through continuing cognitive knots. I was thinking about the notion of what was at my core and the feeling of being extracted and the feeling of extracting that core for examination. I had been collaborating with a soil scientist at the time and used the core sample as a metaphor. My sample, contained materials that were central to my creative practice, many of which related back to my daily life. I also began to explore the pulley motif. I wanted to allude to strain, being tugged on, and the endless cycles of daily life. The photo in the middle exemplifies the simultaneous feelings of joy and the weight that I wanted to convey. The rope that connects the decorative gear forms on the left is made from hundreds of stacked circles of onesie paper. The slow process of using the paper as beads was calming and satisfying in a tactile sense. Here I integrated my used cotton nursing pads along with paper that I made with my children from flax that we collected on our land. I couched wool around the pads, alternating with perforations. The cyclical forms reference tracks, gears, and pulleys once again. They pull taut, then go slack. The notion of being tugged and pulled was on my mind as I struggled in my personal life. Flax, in turn, becomes an important material because of its connection to place, its accessibility, and its hair-like qualities. At the onset of the pandemic, I came to some realizations about my health and well-being as it related to my marriage. While we were stuck inside our home together for months on end, I began making these pieces which marked time once again. Each day I couched a piece of yarn alternating between black and white. With each passing day, I dropped a stitch in the place where the yarns met. These read from top to bottom, at which point there are a few stitches holding the yarn to the paper backing. The forms that I created were reminiscent of metamorphic rocks, which I consider an apt metaphor for that time. Metamorphic rocks started out as some other type of rock, but have been substantially changed from their original form. Metamorphic rocks form when rocks are subjected to high heat and high pressure. As I mentioned, shortly after the pandemic began, my marriage began to unravel, and my creative practice reflected that unraveling, especially once my divorce was finalized. This period felt simultaneously unhinged, joyful, and chaotic. In her essay on the importance of memoir in praise of navel-gazing, Melissa Phoebos asserts, "Listen to me. It is not gauche to write about trauma. It's subversive. The stigma of victimhood is a time-worn tool of oppressive powers to gaslight the people they subjected into believing that by naming their disempowerment, they're being dramatic, whining, attention-grabbing, or else beating a dead horse. By convincing us to police our own and one another's stories, they have enlisted us in the project of our own continued disempowerment." My work became much more spontaneous and haphazard. Fibers, both in the form of handmade paper and fabric, became particularly important at this time. I recognized their healing powers. In August of 2021, I moved to Finland with my 2 children as a single parent. This was a break, a reset, and a time of learning. The tiny village we landed in was called Solf. It's located near the sea and is populated by the Swedish language minority population. On the left, you can see how flax is used to insulate the log homes that people live in there. Almost all of the dwellings had been moved to Solf from other locations after being disassembled and rebuilt on site, like Lincoln logs. The parallels between this and what I was going through resonated with me. While in Solf, I made work that was inspired by the notion of home, as well as the actual homes in the region. I used the Lincoln log motif and used the traditional house paint, which was made collectively each year by the villagers using local pigments. Visual tension and release continued to play a major role in this work. As with previous work, material and process were important to me in Solf. I was also exploring contradictions between comfort and discomfort. For example, the piece on the left is woven like a cozy blanket, but underneath you see a fluorescent cautionary orange. My children attended Swedish language schools, so I had a heightened awareness of language and communication. I considered phrases in English that contained the word home, such as homebound, homebody, and home pace. By removing the word home, the words that remained felt more menacing: hit, work, broken, grown, life. I struggled to let go of my romantic and conditioned notions of what home means, having thought of it for years as somewhere over the rainbow, so to speak. Having found myself essentially homeless during the pandemic, I gained a new understanding of home that is less based in fantasy and more rooted in the immediate reality of my body. Halfway through our year in Finland, my children and I moved to a new coastal town in Swedish-speaking Finland called Jakobstad, which you see here in these pictures. In Jakobstad, I continued to explore the notion of my body as home, as a whole and sufficient dwelling that we carry with us. To do this, I focused on the bodily act of making, as well as materials connected to the body, such as textiles, hair, and nipple covers. The tondo, or round form, has become the work in its entirety rather than just a motif within. Here I began working with wool from Icelandic sheep, linen from Finland, shrunken sweaters, and hand-spun yarn. Some of these pieces, such as the one on the right, relate to the body in the sense that they can be worn. I'm interested in bringing my work back onto the body and to consider how it relates to a living human form. This film, which is a collaboration with a Finnish filmmaker, Scottish sound artist, American choreographer, and Finnish dancer, features my costumes and concept design. The dancer repeatedly makes gestures that allude to using a drop spindle as a metaphor for pulling things together while also spinning out. On the left, you can see that the trees and vines take the place of yarn. This film was inspired by the idea of being untethered, spinning out, as I mentioned, searching for home and connection to place. These themes resonated with all of the collaborators, especially in the wake of the pandemic. I'm going to now switch screens so that I can show you the film. It's brief. It's about 6 minutes long. I should say that this is not the final edit of the film. The sound will change in time, but I think it's still going to be useful to get to see and hear it. So since returning to the States and moving to rural Maine, I've continued exploring the role of the body in my work through materials and process. I've been processing local wool and spinning yarn that includes my own hair alongside other animal fibers. The piece on the left is a companion to the work First and Last, which you saw earlier, but this one integrates yarn spun with my hair throughout it alongside the paper made from my children's used onesies. All of the materials came from close proximity to our bodies, merged together into a single work. This is part of a recent series which ties together the embodied practice of spinning wool with human hair on a drop spindle, along with stitching. It's a continued exploration into tension and release, voids, materiality, place, and nature. These processes, materials, and ideas resonate as they relate to healing my home and healing my body. Here you can see some of these pieces together and the casual display methods that I use. They're not framed and they exist as objects on the wall. I'm interested in moving away from the frame and moving closer to the body as a way to make my work more accessible and to honor textile traditions. Thank you so much for allowing me to share my work, and I look forward to spending some time in conversation with you now.
Thank you, Diana. That was fascinating. While you're coming back on, I want to share with you 2 comments, and then we have a lot of questions for you. Barbara Dunn wrote, "It is so reassuring that some moms have the mindfulness to make sense of their maternal experiences. I love your use of our maternal trappings, breast pads, etc. I so wish that I'd had the depth to think as you did. I was so exhausted with 2 tykes 17 months apart that I was just elated to get them fed. Best wishes on your journey." And Allison Schwabe says, "Having found myself living in 2 foreign countries other than my own on account of my spouse, how did you decide that that's where you wanted to move? And how have you found that living in another country has changed your art?"
Thank you. Those are really great questions. So one of the reasons I was drawn to Finland is because of the support that's in place for children and for families in general. I knew I had a sabbatical coming up. I had been working in Wyoming and teaching at the university there, and I knew I had leave that I could take, and I wanted to be able to travel as a family and make that be a rich experience for everyone. And as I was looking for artist residencies, I found that almost all of them were for the artist solely, and children were not invited. So that was a real challenge because my kids are part of my life, and they would be with me. And I started to do some digging in Finland, and I found that, in fact, children were welcome at most of the residencies I found there. So that was really one of the biggest selling points. And also a lot of my work, I didn't talk about it here, but I've done a lot of work in terms of like pedagogy and as it relates to early childhood education and like learning art. And so I was really interested in the education system in Finland. And finally, one other piece is that in Finland, rather than teaching art in school, they teach craft, or they call it slöjd. And so I was really interested in the fact that children in compulsory school are learning to work with textiles and things like wood, so hard and soft materials, as something that's really valued and a compulsory part of everyone's education. And so that was part of the work I did there too, was learning more about what that system looked like and what it meant to integrate craft into education from a very early age. So those are a couple of reasons why.
Well, that's a great answer. And it plays well into the next question, which is, can you talk a little bit about your formal art background? Because it's clear that you have one.
Yeah, I do. So my background is initially in dance and like performance, but I did go to college for art, and I studied printmaking and drawing at Washington University in St. Louis. And then I studied studio art at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale for my MFA. And oddly enough, what I did there in undergrad and graduate school is not at all what I do now. I think that it equally as important to that sort of formal fine art education was the informal education that I received at home, in terms of just learning from my mom how to sew and learning to work with textiles and learning to make things with my hands outside of that formal training. So I think that it was sort of like all of those things combined. And then also when I was, and just also being willing to continue my education, I have been really active in continuing and just sort of realizing like, oh, it's, you don't get a degree and then you're done, but really continuing on. So when I was in Finland, I took a class in textiles that was taught in Swedish, and I'm sure I missed a lot of details, but I also gained a lot. And so I think that that's another big piece of it, is just continuing to learn. That's my background.
Yeah, and there's a question here about whether that was the first time you started working with wool rather than with cotton, flax, plastic, found objects, etc.
That's a good question. I think I had worked some with wool before, but there was a pretty significant shift. The class that I took while I was in Jakobstad was all about processing wool sort of from the very raw stages. So we, washed and cleaned the fibers and carded them, and then like explored different ways of manipulating them. So it was really just like this all-encompassing, like working with wool type class, and we wove and felted and did lots of different things, which got me really excited. Also, when you're traveling, you only have access to certain materials, or at least I didn't have the resources to haul materials with me. So I really had to work with the materials that were readily available,
Sure.
and wool being one of them. So I think that that was another thing, just the fact its presence in my life there made it much more like abundant in my work. So yeah, that was a shift. I hadn't thought about it, but absolutely.
Yeah. One of the questions was about creating the video. Did
Yeah.
the fact that you had a background in dance make it easier for you to work with the dancer who then is featured in the video? And what were the other positives and challenges?
Yeah, so the dancer, Karina, is Finnish, and I will say that her work was primarily with a wonderful friend of mine, choreographer Jessica Kondrath, who's American. And so the process of making that video piece was really lots of people all over the world communicating and coming together in various capacities at various different times. So a lot of the work, the actual one-on-one work, happened between Jessica and Karina in Finland after I had already come back to the States. And I guess that was one of the joys and challenges, is that we were all in conversation once I had come back, and they were actively, like, the film was being made, but I couldn't physically be there. And so I think it's just the complexities of making that project happen when we were living all over the world was tricky, but also kind of magical that it was possible to make it happen. And I will say too, one thing that made it really possible was the financial support that I was able to access in Finland. I think that I was really surprised by how many supports are available and accessible, even to people who are from other countries, to make work. And so that made it possible, but I won't say it was like an easy process.
Mm-hmm.
Complicated.
Yeah, it's a completely different kind of art form.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it was a collaboration, I think, is even more tricky than if you were micromanaging every little bit of it, where it's just your vision. Collaboration is different.
It was not micromanaging at all. It was sort of trusting that through communication, and just trusting in other people's intuition, and working together. It was not a micromanaging situation in the least.
You also mentioned collaborating with your children. So what did they think about collaborating with you on making your art? And are there other types of collaboration that you explore?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. So it was something that happened more easily, I think, when they were a little bit younger. They were more interested. I think that now, just developmentally, as like a preteen, there's maybe a little bit less interest in, working with your mom. So that's shifting. But I think that I think it's natural for it to shift. I think that our creative process is always shifting and changing. So yeah, I think that just processing, what it meant to be a mom and an artist was more in the front and center of my mind when they were littler too. And so I would say that that's not as actively a part of my work right now, which is, I think, fine and natural. Of course, it'll always be there. And right now, I'm really excited about just having recently moved to Maine. I'm excited about collaborations that are springing up organically here, especially those that happen across disciplines. So working at the university, I feel really lucky to have met people all over campus and am continuing to really foster those connections. There's a music professor that I'm going to be doing some interesting stuff with this coming year, and other faculty in anthropology that we have intersecting interests. And, my approach is not to force things, but just to sort of naturally see what bubbles up. So I'm not one to sort of do the cold calls and ask people to work with me, but rather like just naturally who I connect with just through life.
And well, that plays beautifully into one of the other questions, which is, what do you formally teach at the university right now?
Yeah, so I'm actually not teaching very much in the position I have now. I'm the director of the gallery here, and that's sort of the bulk of what I do. And then I teach one class in the fall, which is the professional practices class. And then I teach one class in the spring, which is a 2D design class. So I'm really interested in working with students at times of transition. So right when they're getting started and have just moved out of their homes and away from their families and are just learning how to be art students. And then again, as they're about to transition away from being college students and into whatever comes ahead. And those are the moments that interest me most, those transitional times at the very beginning and very end. Yeah.
One of the things that really comes through in your presentation is your use of materials that happen to be at hand. I am particularly impressed by your reuse of onesies, which seem to multiply if you leave them alone for any period of time. You use them in so many fascinating ways. One of our audience members says, how do you feel about your use of human hair, your own human hair, in your artwork? Does it make it too personal? Where clearly you are very comfortable with expressing your inner life through the outer work that you share. Can you talk a little bit about that? Where those boundaries fall for you between things that are personal and things that are just, art in a gallery?
Yeah. Oh, wow. I don't know if I really fully have an answer to that question.
That's okay.
In terms of like working with my own hair, it's something I feel comfortable with. And actually what I like about it is it's a very slow process. Of course, I'm just collecting when I'm getting it cut or like in my comb. So I like how it's also a measure of time. Just the scope of time it takes to collect it is just so vast. And I like the fact that it's not something that I can just go out and buy, but it's like a slow accumulation over time. And I'm interested in those materials that are generated just through daily life or through the body in some way. I think the boundaries question is one that I'm maybe struggling with more. But I think it's a good question for me to think about. And maybe just keep in my mind, but I certainly don't have like a great answer for it right now.
I'm sure it's something that artists, all of us artists, struggle with, is you want to express who you are, but when does that start to feel uncomfortable?
Yeah.
I had a question about your, a couple times your work references geological formations. So you did those core samples, and then you compared your work to metamorphic rock changes. So what is the connection between a dancer, fiber artist, and geology?
Yeah, well, I think that living in Wyoming, there was a natural connection there. Also living outside of town and just really being connected to the land and land formations. But also part of that is like just some of those organic collaborations that happened. So a great friend, Karen Vaughn, she and I both had kids that were many years ago in preschool together. And she's a pedologist, a soil scientist. And so we started this collaborative project together, and it just sort of organically grew. And so some of her interests started to influence me and vice versa. So I think that it's really through collaborations. And then I also was collaborating with a geologist as well. I think those organic connections just sort of brought those natural occurrences to the forefront of my mind, and made me think more about them, and made me think more about like the natural landscape surrounding me. Yeah, so much of that was sort of brought about through collaborations that were happening that I didn't talk about today because it would have been too much. But
well, it's fascinating to see how your work is clearly in series, but that those series switch frequently. Do you work on multiple series simultaneously?
It's a good question. I think that sometimes I don't even realize I'm working in series until, like, in retrospect, I can see how things connect and work together. Because I'm teaching and because I have obligations with the gallery, I'm not particularly productive in my studio for a good solid 9 months of the year. But then there's sort of like this buildup of energy. And when I do get started working again in the summer months, it's really messy and not very coherent. And it's just sort of like this outpouring of stuff. And then I have that period again, those 9 months of not so much time in the studio, to begin to make sense of it and see where things connect and how they connect. So I would say while I'm actively making, it's sort of happening at this subconscious level where I'm not necessarily aware of how everything is connecting or what is a series and what is not. And it's maybe more just in time that becomes clear to me. Time and distance.
That's a great answer.
Yeah.
And here's your final question,
Yeah.
which is, what materials are you planning on working with during this summer creative period?
Oh, that is a really good question, because I'm going to be in Spain for 6 weeks on a residency there. And the area that I'll be in northern Spain, there's a breed of sheep that's endangered. And so I've been in contact with people there that raise this particular sheep. It's specific to this area. It's just right by Basque country. And so I'm really curious about working with materials that are specific to that region. There are also some specific, like, area specific dyes that I hope to explore. And so I'm really interested in just kind of diving into materiality in a new place. And hopefully that will help me to think more about materials in my home here in Maine as well. But it's really mostly going to be a time of exploration, I think, in terms of materials. And I love not really knowing, but just going with a curiosity.
Yeah, and that comes through in your work. It's so inspiring. Thank you so much for sharing it. Just as Diana is inspired by the materials around her in her life or in where she lives, we invite you to join us for Art in Place coming up in July, even though the website says June. That's not correct. It's in July. We hope that you'll join us for Art in Place in July. Go to SAQA.com, look for SAQA events, and register for Art in Place to see how other artists are similarly inspired by where they find themselves and the materials around them. I want to invite everybody to join us next week to hear Thomas Nauer, if I'm saying that right, Nauer's talk about letters, numbers, words, and sentences as part of the programming that comes to you from the Quilt Alliance. It should be really fascinating to hear what he has to say about his art making. And as always, if you've enjoyed this textile talk or any of the other textile talks, please do consider making a donation. Putting on the Textile Talks costs about $54,000 for a year, and we need your help to be able to cover those costs. Diana, thank you again so much for sharing your art, for sharing your life. Hopefully your children are now able to be more helpful than not. And we can't wait to see what you make next. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.